Welcome to Movie Recap. In today's video, we will be going through the 1998 fantasy adventure movie, What Dreams May Come. Turn on subtitles and spoilers ahead. Somewhere in a paradise land of Switzerland, while enjoying his peaceful vacation on his boat, Chris happens to meet a girl, Annie, whose boat collides with his slightly. Chris falls in love with such a pretty and sweet lady. Soon after their first meeting, and later takes her back to the United States, where they hold a happy wedding ceremony. A few years later, they have two lovely children, the son and the daughter. One day morning before heading to school, the daughter asks her mom to pick them up after school. But since she is pretty busy with a business meeting that day, Annie asks the nanny to do them a favor instead. Chris reminds his son to focus his attention on the coming math exam and gives lunch boxes to them before they're leaving. As the car is driving away slowly, Chris sees them off on a country road filled with fallen violet petals. However, the father never knows that this is his last time for him to say goodbye to his two kids. A subsequent car accident claims both lives suddenly, putting an end to the family's peaceful life. Later at a funeral held in a church, the husband and wife regret it a lot and hold their hands tightly, struggling hard through the great pains and trying to bury all their sorrows deep at their bottom heart. 4 years later, Chris becomes a well-known pediatrician, while Annie is focusing on repairing and drawing oil paintings. One night as it's raining heavily, Chris rushes on the highway back to send a painting to Annie. When he reaches a tunnel, a car accident happens right in front of him. He tries his best as a pediatrician to save the wounded. During that time, however, another car crash occurs suddenly, causing a car to lose its control and smash Chris down deadly. He's soon sent for emergency medical care, but unfortunately he can't survive and dies at the hospital due to the fatal injury. In panic, Chris's soul wanders back home immediately, believing that he's still alive, but only finds that only the dog can sense him. While he's entirely transparent to his friends and the wife who's in great sorrow and can't stop crying for the loss of him. It is such a huge strike for Annie, she has to find her only comfort from the only living but dying dog with a terminal disease. She still remembers she intended to take it for euthanasia previously but got refused by her daughter back then. Seeing the painting Paradise that she draws as a memory for her late husband, Annie recalls the place where they first met, and also their promising plan to spend the rest of their life there after retirement. As suggested by the doctor, Annie keeps writing her diaries as a way to ease her depression. But for some reason, she feels he's still around her, especially when Chris tries to guide her to write down his love confession to her. But it can't help anything but just increase Annie's missing of her husband. Chris tries to hug her and give her some companionship, but to no avail, for it can't be felt by Annie. Realizing that his attempts only cause more sorrows to her, Chris decides to move on. Later, after walking through a long dark tunnel, Chris wakes up to see himself placed in heaven, which is full of colorful flowers on the mountain and inhabited by singing birds. Chris is astonished to see the flowers made of wet paint and the dying dog who seems pretty healthy and runs over to welcome its master home. Later, he comes to an old tree and looks out into the distance. Everything looks so vivid and familiar to him, he's so excited to find that he's actually placed inside the paradise world drawn by Annie. He then yells Annie's name to the distant mountain, hoping Annie could hear that. He keeps searching this paradise world where they dream of spending their old age and comes all the way to a lake. He loses his footing and falls into the lake. Right then, he sees a man shouting at him in the far distance. The man named Albert is actually the last one Chris saw before his death in the car accident. Albert pulls Chris out, telling him that Annie created such a paradise world for him. Walking across the lake, they see a magic house with no windows. Albert then makes a window on the wall through which they overlook another different wonderland. Albert tells Chris that he can actually control this world freely with his imagination. Meaning on the other side, when Annie is drawing a wisteria tree on the painting, Chris spots out a similar purple tree appearing suddenly in the far distance. Once he sees Annie dancing at the foot of the mountain and her red scarf blown away, Chris can't hold his excitement any longer. He yells Annie's name and jumps off a cliff, landing lightly on the red flowers. He runs through the red flowers at his full speed and catches the drifting red scarf finally. Later, he comes to appreciate the beautiful wisteria tree and gets to know that any happenings in the human world would be simultaneously reflected in the painting paradise. Right then, Annie in the other world is suffering and begins to wipe out the wisteria tree she's just painted, which however also disappears in the painting paradise. Chris seems to feel Annie's pains at that time and shouts his love out loud to Annie. Back to the lake again, Chris finds a tiger puppet that his son used to play with. He's eager to meet his children there, but Albert just reminds him that he can actually wish for anything in his paradise. After waking up in the magic house the next day, he meets a fairy girl who brings him into an idyllic world, suddenly where there's no pains and sufferings and people can fly freely in the sky like angels. Chris is told that Albert's job here is to rescue those lost souls. After that, they come to a boat. Chris shares the life story of his daughter. The castle floating above the lake looks like the same handicraft owned by his daughter, who believed that's the place humans would head to after death. While Chris told her that it's just a dreamed world and not real, Chris also recalls the game time with his daughter who was eager to win over him every time but to no success. She failed every time until the car accident claimed her life 3 months later. Chris regrets that a lot and hugs the fairy girl passionately who incarnates as his daughter. At the same time, full of guilt and with no hope for life, Annie changes in her purple dress and commits suicide after leaving her last words on the diary. Learning of his wife's death, Chris falls into great sorrow while believing that it might be good for her to end her sufferings in that way. Albert, however, tells Chris that he would never see her again as she would be brought to hell rather than heaven as a punishment for her suicide. Chris is enraged by that and claims to rescue Annie from hell. Albert, however, warns Chris that if he stays with Annie for more than a few minutes, he may be permanently trapped in hell and can't make his way back to heaven. While the tracker advises Chris that what he can reasonably expect there is just a final farewell to Annie. Despite that, Chris is determined to risk his life to find Annie there. Not long after that, Chris follows Albert and the tracker to a dark tunnel, which leads them to a roaring sea with lightning flashing across the sky. While the ghosts trapped there are struggling underwater, the spirits attack their boat in anger and overthrow it soon. They manage to get rid of them and climb to the beach where they see a burning ship in the far distance, which is said the only passage to enter hell. Right then, Chris stops as he could not feel Annie. He recalls a rainy afternoon with his son when they took shelter from the rain under the tree, talking about the son's changing school to somewhere else. The son was struggling to make a good performance in his study and tried to make his father proud of him. While Chris encouraged his son to pursue his dream and promised that he would always be by his side. On the journey there, Albert turns to his son suddenly and wished Chris to find his mom and takes her back so they all will reunite in heaven. Chris parts ways with him before continuing his search for Annie. Moments later, by taking the elevator, Chris reaches a graveyard and is astonished to find numerous skulls of the dead struggling and groaning on the ground. Chris searches carefully and later catches sight of Annie. He runs at her but suddenly loses his footing and falls all the way to a deep valley where he finds his now horrific-looking home with the wisteria blossoming. The tracker conveys that Annie trapped in hell would suffer amnesia and can't actually recognize him. He then urges Chris to say his quick goodbye to Annie before he's trapped there forever. Chris walks inside his house made from Annie's illusion, but only finds a total mess with rotten and broken pieces of furniture. Annie is later shocked by such an uninvited visitor, for she is unable to remember her suicide and her husband. She stays in despair and is surrounded by the endless darkness only. Chris pretends to be her new neighbor, trying not to frighten her. Annie begins to complain that she's totally at a loss for the power outage and water shortage she has to suffer right now. Because of that, she can't finish her painting before due time. Annie is later shocked by a giant spider and Chris tries to calm her down. While sitting before her unfinished painting, Annie explains that it reminds her of her dead husband and children very often. This is why she's unwilling to leave the shabby house. Chris tries to remind Annie of who he is by telling her that his kids also died from a car accident and his wife was depressed because of that and turned to blame herself all the time for not picking them up herself. His wife committed suicide. No matter how hard he tried to bring her out of depression and encourage her never to give up the hope of life. Right then, Annie is touched deeply by his story and confides that she wants to see her husband now. Chris feels very glad and tells her it's actually not difficult to fulfill her dream. He then lets Annie close her eyes and guides her to recall all the details of their wedding ceremony, where everything seems so sweet and familiar to her. Chris keeps telling Annie all the happenings between them, but she still fails to recall the man standing before her. Unable to stir her memories, Chris gives up his quest to save Annie from hell. But instead of returning to heaven, Chris explains to the tracker that he can't leave Annie to suffer alone there, and would rather join Annie forever in hell. Later, Chris returns to Annie and declares to her his intent to stay. As he keeps appeasing her with gentle words, Annie regains her memories finally and recognizes the man accompanying her. But due to his staying there too long, Chris starts to feel cold and loses his consciousness later. By the time he wakes up again, he's surprised to find himself placed in heaven with Annie and surrounded by fragrant flowers and singing birds everywhere. They tongue massage passionately but without hormone, let go on the spot due to the timely interruption of an uninvited visitor, the tracker. Later, they reunite happily with their lovely dog and 2 kids. Chris proposes reincarnation so he and Annie can spend their life together again. Sometime later on a sunny day, the baby Chris and fat baby Annie encounter each other again in the same way as the first meeting at their adulthood. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get new movie recaps.